What's up, y'all? Welcome to the Nihilo podcast. I'm your host. I'm Eddie. Good to be back with you guys. I've got my friend here, Sinan, and Sinan is a registered dietitian, and he works with StrongerU Nutrition. He's a coach. He's lived all over the place, originally from Turkey, but this guy's got a wealth of experience, and so I want to have him give his best advice to you guys, and hopefully he's going to change your life, right, Sinan? You're going to change everybody's life today?
That's the goal today, so we'll see what I can knock out.
No small feat, right? I think one thing that's interesting is when we're online right now, if you go on your Instagram or your TikTok, there's just nothing but, and I know it's algorithm based, so let's be honest, I kind of like this kind of stuff, health nerd. But if you go on your Instagram or TikTok, there's nothing but a bunch of different diets. Like you've got Paul Saladino talking about carnivore diets, and you've got people talking about vegan diets and all these different documentaries coming out. But if I'm someone that wants to just figure out how to get healthy, like what's the first thing I should do? Just based on the fact that there's all this confusing information online. Like what should I do? How do I start?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it is such an oversaturated market, right? There's so much out there. And I say market because everybody thinks of it as, it's just it's a field of health and wellness for sure, but there's also a market power in terms of what gets pushed really hard, like you said, through the algorithms, through the marketing power. When we check out even at stores, right, you see magazine fronts, and you're just like, oh, it's talking about this diet, it's talking about that diet. And that stuff has a lot of biased opinion on us too. It kind of drives us to think about those things more frequently. So it is a very, very saturated market. And I think one of the biggest things that we need to do as consumers, if we're ever thinking about where do I start? Where do I get a hold of my health, right? Where do I really grasp this whole diet thing? I think we just need to find a way of stepping away from social media and stepping away, and not in a way of just like, hey, deactivate your account, don't look at it on there. Just mute some of those accounts if you're trying to make a change in your life, right? Just start simple, because a lot of those things are going to pull you into a complex direction where you're going to say, okay, right, it's either all out or nothing. And we want to get to a point where we need to find out what nutrition 101 is, right? Calories in, calories out, which we'll probably end up talking about. We need to get to that level first before we jump to this, like, what are the extremes? How do I make extreme happen?
Yeah, and I think that sometimes these online guys, for the sake of clicks, it's all about likes, comments, and views. That's the economy. It's the attention economy. I think for the sake of that, a lot of times these guys are trying to hit us with this big, punchy thing, right? They're trying to hit us with that, I forget, like one of those guys talks about like, vegetables are BS, like just straight. And so they're trying to get this like big, like reaction out of you, because that's what drives drives what the algorithm and drives the comments. It gets those views up, and in turn they're able to sell more product. And so you're spot on calling it that, right? Like it is that marketplace. And so people are really confused by all this stuff. But if I'm going to go listen to this stuff, it is confusing, right? Like all of a sudden I'm trying to follow this crazy carnivore diet, and I've never even been on a diet period. Like what must someone be thinking when they're going through that 2 weeks into something like that, right?
100%. And I think, you hit it right on the head. It needs to be, if it's a 30-second clip, a 90-second clip, like it needs to be sexy in order for it to get clicked on. And for it to be approachable, it needs to have some kind of just like a, wow, I had no idea that was the truth kind of a factor to it. And oftentimes it's really, there's not much science backing those things up with a lot of the posts that we see, right? So that's a scary part of it for sure. And if we're looking at it from a perspective of like, how do you dive into something that's on the extremer side of like a carnivore diet, right? Just something that like very, very focused lens goes to one particular, ingredient or style of consumption. How do you even start? And just, me with 8 years of nutrition as a registered dietitian, some of these things I still look at and I'm like, dude, what is happening? Like, I don't even know where to begin if I was to try that, right? So there's no step one, step two involved. It's just like, hey, if you do this, this is the feedback that you get from your body. So just do it. Like it's very clickbaity, like you said, and I think you hit that right on the head.
Yeah, clickbaity is right. So have you had, maybe I'm asking this off the cuff, but have you had people come to you? Do you? Well, first I should ask, do you have people track what they eat for a set period of time before you jump into giving them like diet advice?
Yeah, I think tracking, we do have them track while they're working with one of our coaches as well. And we have them track for not necessarily just a meticulous detail of like, hey, let's look at the numbers and let's make sure you're not off by a gram or two. It's more so let's track to get an understanding of consistency over time. So we have everybody track while they're navigating through any diet, whether that means like, let's change the ingredients you're consuming. If we shift more towards, a plant-based diet, if we shift more towards, moderating certain ingredients based on a health condition. But I think tracking is going to be that foundation. Like if we rewind back to what we just said before, how do you start on some of these diets, especially ones that are like on a much more extreme scale? Get an understanding of what you're consuming each day, right? It's so easy for us to dive into something that's like, hey, buy my program because I can promise you extreme results, right? But like, it's almost like jumping to a 301 course without doing the nutrition 101 course, right? It's like, how do you need to track, you need to understand energy balance, you need to understand what macronutrients actually are and where your body stands right now for your goals before you dive into the extreme.
Have you ever had anybody show up that is trying one of these like pretty extreme 301, 401 diets before, and then you're like, hold on, let's back off?
100%. I think I would say more than 50% of the conversations, the nutrition consultations that I have are based around, hey, I've tried this before and or like I'm giving this a shot. How do I correct my behavior, right? It's just it's more reactive and corrective than proactive conversations of, hey, can you teach me a little bit about just my personalized nutrition, how I should, or what I should know about the nutrition education before I try one of these 301, 401. So it always seems like it's flipped script. And one of the things too is that like with a lot of these 301, 401 courses, like if you, again, I love comparing to a college course curriculum because I'm a nerd when it comes to nutrition education, but like, if you think about it, a 301 or 401 course is going to be very specifically channeled in on the fine details of something, right? You're never going to go in and like learn just a grand scheme of something in a 401 course. And that's where I think that's where a lot of the problem happens, right? That these people get sucked in so well that they don't get any education on the foundations of nutrition. So it's very easy to soak in, like we're a sponge for knowledge, right? So it's really easy to soak in what someone's telling you when you don't have kind of the foundations or the structure behind it.
It feels like to me that most people, if they were to get, and you correct me if I'm wrong, because you're the expert here, you're the professional, but it feels like for me, because the social media is so widespread, so wide scale, everyone's on it, that most people probably are coming off of, or at least coming into, a consultation with, let's say, a dietitian with some like preconceived notions of what they're supposed to be doing, or maybe they need to be deprogrammed. Are you finding that's true? And if that's true, like, are people needing to like sort of like kill old bad habits first? Because it doesn't sound like people are coming in going, like you said, I don't know anything, please help me, right? No, totally. And I think Boston Medical Center had research that came out that said it estimated about 45 million Americans go on a diet every year, and about 50% of them opt for a fad diet, thanks to the marketing power and that drive that we talked about, right? So that's a lot of people that are coming in, about 23 million folks that are coming in each year of saying, hey, I tried a fad diet, it didn't work, how can we fix it? And I think from the coaching lens, when I first stepped into nutrition coaching back in 2015, it was a lot of conversation around how do we, the word deprogram that you said it hits home. Like I love that word because it was a lot of conversation back then about how do we deprogram some of the older population because they've been in their ways for 40, 50, 60 years, right? It's like, how do you change somebody who is not stubborn, but has been doing the same thing for so long that you have to teach them something new or pull them out of what they've been doing? And what I've seen the lens of nutrition and nutrition coaching shift to is we're having those same conversations of how do you deprogram somebody from what they've done or what they're doing, but not with the 60, 70-year-old population. We're now seeing it with the 20, 30-year-old population. Yeah, because it's not like they've just been around a long time and so they've heard a bunch of different stuff, right? Maybe in the early, in the 90s, people were like, Atkins diet is what I did, or I was on Slim Fast. But now it's like you've got your pick of the litter, like cornucopia of every type of diet out there. And like I have friends that have literally tried all of these for just a couple weeks. Like I had a friend that's been vegan. They literally texted me a couple days ago, like, "Hey man, am I allowed to like cook with vegetables on the carnivore diet?" You know, and I'm like, "Wait a second, you're now on a carnivore diet? Like what? First of all, you barely even moved, let alone." You know, now you're doing such a crazy, wild, advanced diet for someone. And so it feels like those basics need to be so much more popular. What do you feel like are the first few things when someone's coming in from one of these crazy diets that you feel like you need to do, like practical, like, hey, you need to go back to the drawing board? Like, what are those things?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think the mental state of it is one of the biggest parts, right? I don't want to confuse dietitians and nutrition coaches with counselors and therapists, but there is a lot of, we tend to, it's this weird thing that a social media account that has a big following tends to somehow pull somebody's trust more than a professional in the field sometimes, right? And that's one of the scariest things in my opinion. And what we have to do is that deprogram, there's a lot of trust building that needs to be done there, right? I think about like stages of change when these folks are coming in with, hey, I know I kind of screwed up, right? I went carnivore for 2 weeks and then I shifted over to vegan for 2 weeks, and my body, I gave my body no time to adjust in between the two, hence why I didn't see any change. And now my blood panel's all over the place. Like, they know what they've done wrong, but there's still no level of trust yet because they're like, because you're not offering me anything sexy, anything instant gratification driven, right? So I think a lot of that first conversation is about just, let's just figure out what we've done, right? Don't demonize anything that they've done, and let them not demonize any of the food that they've eliminated in any of these diets. And then pull them back into conversation, right? Keto, for example, like I can go down a rabbit hole forever, but a lot of the conversations are like, hey, I know I'm not performing in my workouts how I should be, right? And that's why it's not reflecting on why my body composition is not changing the way I want it to be. But I've been on keto for so long, or I had such a unhealthy relationship with the keto diet that I'm scared to introduce carbohydrates back into my life, right? That's a conversation I hear, I would say, 1 out of 5 nutrition consultations that I do. For me to go into that conversation and then be like, no, you actually need to bring in carbohydrates. Let's go ahead and bring you to 300 or 400 grams of carbohydrates per day. Like, that alone would just be like, hang up the phone. I'm never talking to this dietitian again. Right? So you need to find a happy median of like, give bite-sized pieces in terms of how do we integrate enjoyable carbohydrates, or really anything that's been eliminated in these extreme diets, in a way that they're like, okay, I see what you're putting on the table. I'll meet you halfway and give you this much. And what we need to provide as professionals is the science and the backing behind it, so that they're not just coming into it as like, I listened to this person, now I'm listening to this person. It's more like, this is science backed, this is evidence backed, and that's why I'm okay following this dietitian's suggestions.
Yeah, I think you're speaking to something that most people don't think about a lot, and that's, there's so much more psychology involved when it comes to diet. There's so much more emotional health that goes on in dieting than we would like to lead on. Most of us like to think, hey, I'm a science experiment. I'm a math problem. This plus this equals this. But the truth is, we all have our own specific socialization. We've all been brought up a specific way. We've all been influenced by culture, by social media. And so we have preconceived notions and thoughts of what may or may not work. And we have fears in us around things that may harm us or what have you. And so what you're doing is, like you said, you don't want to, they're different, but in a sense they are connected. They're not mutually exclusive. And so, you're having to sort of break down, like you mentioned, not just what I believe is true about a diet and how it'll work for me, but also like, what am I afraid of? Why have I joined this diet in the first place? And why do I think, what happens if I fail? There's so many other things around the dieting that you're going to have to sort of cut through with what on the surface appears to be practical steps and wisdom. Like, let's say someone, like you mentioned, keto diet, kind of a little, I don't believe carbs work. When in fact, there may be a little bit of like actually I have a fear that if I eat carbs, there may be, maybe I'm going to get fat, or what might that do to me? And what does that say about who I am? So there's so much more you're cutting through. And so, man, way to catch that, dude. You must see that a bunch.
Yeah, I think, and that's the scary part, right? I think we're shifting more and more and more in the mental state of it, which is it's scary to see. Like, it's not the numbers on paper in terms of calories. It's not the numbers on paper in terms of macronutrients. It's not even the ingredient conversations right now. It's more so the population shifting to, like you said, like, having fear around certain things just because they're so bought in to some of these fad diets, and I think that's where, again, we're seeing a bigger lens of, even negative body image and like certain things like that, right? Like out of the crazy number, the 23 million that we see on a diet every single year, and 50% of those trying a fad diet, like about 62% have dealt with negative body image, and that's why they're doing that, right? And then that already gives you a scary approach of like, oh boy, like, the reason they're doing something extreme is because they're not comfortable with their body or how they feel about their body. So that's another mental conversation that comes into it. But then where the end of the road, where we have to be like, okay, pump the brakes, get with the dietitian, let's speak ASAP, is that about 77% of those folks that do a fad diet because they're not comfortable with body image end up reporting some kind of inadequate nutrition accuracy, which just ultimately, in simple terms, means that they're not getting a sufficient intake of essential nutrients to fulfill the requirements for optimal health, right? So it's scary that they're so bought in to some of these things as consumers when they know they're not doing something for longevity or sustainability, and that's where a lot of the mental deprogramming comes in, right? Like, I have to earn I think we're at a point in the nutrition field now, especially probably fitness too, to be honest with you, where we have to earn a significant amount of trust from the member before we're able to coach them through a successful session.
That's right. Yeah. And I think, it's the social media element of all this, even podcasts like this one. I mean, a lot of those types of people that are enjoying this, there's certainly like people that just at face value are enthusiasts around fitness and health. But there are a large percentage of us that are coming to this conversation with some junk, like something. Like you mentioned, we are fundamentally unhappy with either what we look like or how we're performing. And there's something behind that. And so, and even some of this wild adherence to these diets and what have you, all of that plays into this. And so they might be adhering to these things, but really philosophically, it's not that they don't want the results, but they're so married to something deep in them that they just feel like they need to accomplish it. Whether, like you mentioned, 62% of people with body image. I mean, that's significant, man. We're talking 6 out of 10 people, over 6 out of 10 people are unhappy because they're too skinny, unhappy because they're too big. And so there's fear and anger and shame and all these things around dieting, exercising. And what you're finding is, hey man, because you're so married to this diet, because of all these emotional things, maybe you may or may not talk about explicitly, you're actually deficient you're not getting enough protein. You get your blood work done and you're off on all sorts of crazy things because of your adherence to the diet. And so the very thing you're trying to solve your issue with is actually causing you this dysfunction. I mean, talk about a catch-22, dude.
Yeah, I mean, it's just we're going for the Band-Aid approach of what gives the vanity feedback, and we're forgetting about the optimal health piece of it, right? It really is. Yeah. It's crazy to think about. And, when you think about those statistics too, one of the biggest things that we're seeing in terms of trends in population too is that, like, previously this conception of body image and diets around body image were around the female population, right? So we're now seeing 69% of males reporting dissatisfaction with their body in terms of weight or how they look too, right? That's a big number for guys. Like,
wow.
Imagine getting up, going to the gym, come back and be like, great workout, but I still feel like garbage in how I look, and just beating yourself up that way. That's why we're seeing this wide cast net of, like, I know I have an issue with seeing how I look in the mirror, and I know in order to resolve it, I'm going to go for a vanity Band-Aid diet, ultimately, instead of pumping the brakes, figuring out what Nutrition 101 looks like, and then just kind of building in. That's why, like, one of the tangents I could always go on, especially seeing the, more and more reports about, teenagers who are unhappy with how they look, right? One of the things is, like, if we were to be providing, education in nutrition or healthy eating or lifestyle change or behavior change in some of these, like, middle school and high school courses, right? Yes. Like, imagine offering a Foundations of Nutrition elective in a early high school course, right? To give them a better idea, then we wouldn't have, 78% of, females when they reach about 17 that are unhappy with their bodies, right? That's a big number.
Wow.
So we want to think about those things. And I think you hit it right on the head before when you said the social media piece. We spend so much time scrolling through social media, and whether we literally channel in on one person or one post, as we go through some of these, even if it takes us half a second to pass through somebody's post, we start kind of creating this bias in our head of like, if I was a character in a video game, what would I look like, right? Like that's ultimately how I think about it. So like the ideal version of me walking out on the street here on a summer day is like, I need to have a six pack because that's normal for a guy in his early 30s, right? I need to make sure I can squat 400 pounds because every single person I follow on Instagram squats 400 pounds like it's their day job, right? Like we tend to create this like very tight window frame around like the internet, which is so difficult and so difficult to ultimately unprogram and get them to a healthier headspace.
And it's not real. And that's the other, you not only are you crafting an algorithm, knowingly or unknowingly, that is designed for what you want to see. Like your feed is full of dudes squatting 400 or 500 pounds. They're all ripped to shreds. They're all on this one very specific diet. And you go, that's the world that must live in. So not only have you crafted that world, but also you're also dealing with the fact that those people are producing performative pieces of social media that are oftentimes doctored and not telling you the full story. I know that's true for, my wife, for Sarah. I mean, she's a former college volleyball player and her feeds are filled with, women online that are, they're doctored up. They're wearing crazy amounts of makeup. They've face tuned and body tuned themselves. So not only do we have this image of what we're supposed to do, they're also chasing a performative aspect of social media that's not real. It's not real. And so it's unattainable because it's not even reality. Yeah. And so, wow, talk about shadow boxing that for your whole life.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that image of fear, right? I think we've come to a point where we create so much fear around what a version of me would look like had I, not done these things or had I not gone on extreme, regimens. It's like we're seeing that fear more than we've ever had before. So on the backside of it, on the coaching side, there's a lot more, like, trust me, and I will guide you through it. Conversations happening more so than ever before.
Yeah, of course. Well, then so you've got that side of it, right? But then you've got the more stubborn amongst us that, human nature is as such. People just don't want to they don't want to feel like they're wrong. It's kind of like, watching the Super Bowl. I don't know how much of a football fan you are, but like, watch the Super Bowl. Everyone heard about Brock Purdy because he was the quarterback of the 49ers. At some point, people just don't want to be wrong. Like people scouted a guy. You're like, he has to not be good because we just said he wasn't in the first place. Yeah. So like at a certain point, with Tom Brady, it was like, okay, fine. He won 7 Super Bowls. I guess he's pretty good. It's like with diets, we latch onto one, and I'm guilty of this. Even my, coming out of, I was like the protein shake, that bodybuilding.com, tnation.com. I mean, I was birthed in that era, right? This late 90s, early 2000s. Like that's what it was about. But it comes to a point where it's like, okay, maybe you find a keto diet or a vegan diet, and you got all this different stuff to back it up. Like at a certain point, we just don't want to be wrong. And so when we get into these conversations with a nutritionist, it's like, man, what about this and what about that? And then we look for confirmation bias, right? We're looking for the study. We're looking for the documentary that confirms what we already believe. I mean, do you see much of that like stubborn guy or gal that just is like, or maybe even online, do you see that take place at all?
For sure, right? It's a lot of the but conversations that are happening, right? You're like, yeah, but you schedule a nutrition consultation so that we can get down to the root of this problem. Not, but we're here so that we can both try and prove a point and see who wins the conversation, right? So I think we're definitely seeing that. And I think that, like, how you break that conversation down, like, I love, again, when you said deconstruct like that, I love the only way to win that conversation ultimately is to deconstruct it back to evidence and why it's that way, right? So when I have these conversations of I did keto for a little while and keto worked really well for me. So like what you're saying is kind of scaring me because you're talking about, carbohydrates. So like I have a point, right? Like I'm right in what I'm saying, right? Can you just, affirm that? And I think that's where a lot of the difficult conversation happens, where in the dietitian field, in the nutrition field, we have to push a little more evidence to be like, hey, you have a point, but like this is really where the root of that conversation lies. And that's one of the big things, right? Like for example, I just had a keto conversation with somebody earlier today. They're coming off of a keto diet and they're like, hey, keto worked really well. I lost a lot of weight initially, but I'm seeing a plateau. Is there any way like you can kind of break down why I'm seeing a plateau? Because I shouldn't. And I'm like, I shouldn't. I'm like, you're so confident in saying I shouldn't. I'm not, I'm not trying to challenge them, but I'm like, I want to know why you're so confident in the I shouldn't piece, because I would love to know the science behind it, right? Keto has always been proven to, have a really good impact as instant gratification, because carbohydrates do retain a little bit of water. And when we do reduce water in our bodies, the scale tends to drop down, right? So I was like, cool. And then I kind of paused there and I let him speak, and he was just like, yeah, but like if I'm under consuming, the carbohydrates, then I should be in a place where that weight loss should keep going down and down and down. And now my workouts should be getting better. And I was like, hold on for a second. I was like, you just told me without carbohydrates, your workout should be getting better, which should in turn fuel why your body composition is changing for the better, right? So it's a really difficult conversation of like, they get 3 steps ahead and you have to pull them all the way back. And there has to be some kind of like a very evidence-backed, but simple understanding of why that happens, right? So like, for example, for that conversation alone, I was just like, think about this. Americans on average eat about 250 to 300 grams of carbohydrates per day, or about 55% of their daily caloric intake comes from carbs, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not demonizing at any point of carbohydrates here, but if at any point I was to pull carbohydrates completely out of your diet, I've dropped your daily consumption by 55% that we have to figure out how to kind of adjust for, but we're probably never going to hit 55% of a drop, right? So I'm like, you're in a caloric deficit, you're consuming less calories than you're burning, hence why you've lost weight, right? But you're going to hit a point in your journey or in your timeline that you're like, hey, my body's adjusted to this like very low amount of calories, and I just don't feel like I can sustain this. I just don't feel like my workouts are fueled the way they used to be. But I don't want to admit that it's the fact that I put away 300 grams of carbohydrates in my very active day.
Yeah. So they're coming to you and they're saying, well, this worked before. Mm-hmm. How do you help me keep it working? Yeah. And it should work because it's supposed to, or it should be because that's the way it is. And you're like, well, you came to me, right? Yeah. So let me help reorient you. And it's like, well, no, it should be because it is. And so you're having to break down these like sort of like mental traps that these people have put themselves 100%. In, and you're trying to like reorient them. Yeah. That being said, though, there is a lot of different diets. Yes. And so I want to go back and forth with you on some of these and get your opinions on them. And then you tell us what you think works and what doesn't. So let's go through some of these. We're already on keto anyway. Keto is one of my personal favorites. I've used the keto diet at various times. There's plenty of studies around ketogenic diets with cancer and how there's been some benefit there. Dominic D'Agostino, some great research around that. But I'd love to get your overall thoughts, pros and cons of something like a keto diet. What would you say?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, again, for short term, especially if we're not curing any medical conditions or really dealing with any medical conditions using keto. So kind of just to back up there, keto was ultimately designed for medical conditions, right? To cure medical conditions. We see it with epilepsy. We see it with cancer research. But for the average consumer, again, I think it's a very short feedback kind of a diet in comparison to anything we look at for sustainability and longevity. Like I said earlier, like we see a lot of water retention pullback, and not water retention in a bad way. Like carbohydrates do retain water naturally. So when you pull carbohydrates out of a diet, you'll see some of that water come off and the scale come down. And I think where keto really makes its magic point is that instant gratification, where we want to see that number on the scale drop in 2 or 3 days. Keto does that really, really well, right? So I think for like, I've had conversations before. Again, this is giving keto the credit it deserves out of the medical field too. Is that I've had conversations where someone's like, "Hey, I have a wedding in 7 days. I need to be as lean and light as possible." I'm like, "Cool. What are you doing for it?" Right? And then their response is, "I want to do keto for 7 days, but then I want to return back to my regular diet." Right? For a short term, like significant drop, do I hate it? Not really. Right? It pulls a little bit of the overconsumption of carbohydrates out of that little window of time that we need to make a transformation. But for a lifelong diet, unless there's a medical condition attached to it, I don't think there's really a sustainable benefit to it, just because of how centered on fats we get, and fats being 9 calories per gram, whereas carbohydrates and proteins 4 calories per gram. We can really open up Pandora's box with that consumption pattern.
So you think, do you think that long term, so short term, it sounds like you got a diet or something, you got a wedding coming up, you're going to the beach, you got 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month, where you're like, I want to get down as lean as I can, get rid of some of this water weight. You might say, all right, if you're just, if you're just thinking about leaning up, maybe it's a good thing. But for something long term, it doesn't feel sustainable.
I would say
is
so.
That why?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I don't think it feels sustainable, and I would say even 3 or 4 weeks is kind of pushing the extent of it too. Okay. I would say a 1 or 2 week, pull in terms of like, shedding some water, shedding some weight, like pretty quickly. Probably, again, not the healthiest approach, but I would say in terms of a scale success, that would be successful.
So it's not sustainable because 9 calories per gram of fat, you think people just generally overeat, or is there some sort of other plateau that people hit?
Yeah, I mean, our body just we've you go back to the caveman days. It's like we've operated on carbohydrates, right? It's not a matter of like there's some magical science that somebody found out that we actually didn't need the carbohydrates we've consumed for our entire lives. Like that literally debunks the whole like fruit and vegetables are like worthless, right? That's ultimately what we're saying. So one of the big things that we'll see with keto is that like I don't think it's sustainable for the long haul because of, one, carbohydrates are a needed source of how we get through our day-to-day and our energy source. And I think fruits and vegetables are a huge source of micronutrients or vitamins and minerals that, like, if we pull that out, we're probably going to start seeing some kind of a deficiency in some of these vitamins too. If someone's not having fruit because they're demonizing fruit or they're scared of fruit because of the diet that they're on, like, you're probably going to have to sub in a lot of capsulated formulas of vitamins for the fruit that you've now eliminated from your day-to-day.
So there's a micronutrient deficiency taking place here. And certainly like electrolytes, right? Like, I mean, a lot of these electrolyte powders and stuff seem to have arisen right around the time keto has gotten popular. I wonder if there's a correlation there between the fact that people are electrolyte mineral deficient because of their keto diets. Do you think that might be true?
I don't know. I don't know, honestly. Yeah, I think, the way I think about it is from the endurance training perspective of, electrolyte formulas do have some kind of a simple sugar in it just to help our body digest it. And that would be, anti-keto at that point.
That's true.
So I would be curious to see if there is a correlation between those two. But, I tend to feel the same way. Like, I think because of keto, we've seen some of those electrolyte formulas come out with like sugar-free options, right? Or sugar substitute options. And I've just being in the endurance field too, I've tested both of those. I'm like, does the sugar-free option work as well as the regular one? And it's like you get a very, pen on white, like marker on whiteboard answer of like, it doesn't, because natural sugars are what activate a lot of these things and will activate a lot of the energy that we sustain throughout the day. So it puts us in a really difficult place, because then you start confusing people even more with like sugar-free options, and then we have sugar alcohols and sugar substitutes and all that, right?
Right. I read, certainly Mark Sisson's come out with Primal Blueprint and stuff, and I know he's backed off on a lot of his like strict keto stuff. But what would you say to somebody who's like, hey, but if I get into ketosis, then I could burn fat as my primary fuel source as opposed to glucose? Couldn't that work the same? Wouldn't I be okay if I did that?
I mean, yeah, it's very, you'll need a lot of day-to-day research, and you essentially have to turn yourself into a case study in that matter to get into ketosis every single day, right? It's like there's no room for error in that sense. That sustainability, again, drops even a bigger percentage. So as, of a hardo as I sound, it's like, no, if you put in consistent strength training work, and then if you aim to get 7,500 to like 10,000 steps, I'm just setting an example out there, every single day, you would still burn the same amount of, fat or unwanted weight that you would. So
yeah, so you could try, and like you mentioned, I think the sustainability piece there is huge, right? Because you're talking about if you've got to stay under, let's say 20, 30, maybe even some lucky people, I got to stay under 50 carbs a day. Like there's no margin for error. So like if you eat some little thing and all of a sudden, boom, you're out of ketosis, and it's like, well, then that's just goes out the window. Performance suffers and all that. And certainly if you're competing on any, running some of these Spartan races, marathons, anything endurance related, like your performance is going to just be in the tank. Like I've seen guys trying to do these like Spartan beasts or some of these Ironmans on fully fat adapted, and they're eating like these like almond butter packets while they're trying to run, and like MCT mixes and stuff. And I'm like, holy dude, that first of all, how do you eat that much fat while you're trying to train for something like that, let alone run the race, right? Like it feels like unsustainable.
Yeah, and I think one thing too, like just to wrap up that thought, like it pulls you back in that same like headspace funk, right? We keep going back to this thing of like fear or failure, and like just having that headspace that we've not been introducing a lot in the nutrition space up until these fat diets did really escalate to where they are now, right? So think about something. You gave a perfect example. If somebody's like, if 30 is a cutoff for ketosis for me, and then I end up like accidentally having something that has more carbs than I thought, and I drop into 35 and I'm not in ketosis anymore, think about the headspace that puts that person in, right? They're like, oh, wow, I'm a failure. I couldn't hold to what I needed to. And now I'm in this really gray space of I'm at 35 grams. So like I'm not in ketosis, so I'm a failure, but I'm not going to consume any more because then I completely give up on keto, which I've committed myself to. So they're in the space of like just feeling lost, feeling confused, and feeling like they've ultimately failed. And that's not a healthy wellness space to be in by any means.
What kind of life is that, right? Now you're trying to go out to eat with your friends or your spouse, whatever, and you're like, well, what kind of what kind of seasoning did you use? Is there carbohydrate in it? And so all of a sudden, the sustainability piece, like you mentioned, is just, and all of a sudden maybe they're in this spot where it's like, I'm not losing. What's going on and what's wrong with me? And now then you're starting to spiral into that spot. Okay. Yeah. So that's keto. There's probably more. There's a way more that could be said that I'm sure you could talk about. But let's talk about another of my personal favorites, the vegan diet. Lots of people love the vegan diet, and you go online, and there's this big thing going around with Star Jones right now. Is it Star Jones? No, it's Wendy Williams. Jeez, I just confused Star. Am I racist? I know I'm black, but am I racist for confusing Star Jones and Wendy Williams? Anyway, Wendy Williams just was like, she went a few years ago, I'm going full vegan. Like I've lost 50 pounds from vegan diet, but then something just recently came out. Now she's got like early onset dementia and all these different causes. It's tragic and horrible. You don't have to go into that if you don't want, but I'm curious, pros and cons of vegan diet. What are some good things and some things that maybe aren't so helpful?
I mean, I think the vegan diet really, escalated quickly when a couple of documentaries came out on Netflix, right? That was one of the big things, was like, I've never experimented with the keto vegan diet, but as soon as I saw some of these documentaries, I was like, okay, I'll give it a try. I think it's the vegan diet itself. It's amazing that it introduces a lot of fruit and vegetables into consumers who weren't having it previously, right? Like friends that have done the vegan diet, I've seen them try grains, like whole grains that I've never seen them have before, it's amazing, right? High five. You're trying buckwheat for the first time. You're trying bulgur for the first time. Like, that is amazing. It's unlocked a whole new potential that you've never had before. But I think it's the extremity of how they go from a meat consuming diet to a vegan diet the next day. And then there's this like, perplexed image of like, no, I'm never going back to the meat consumption like I did before. That's so nasty. Like I didn't, you know what I mean? Like it's ultimately like tuning one side out to come into one side. That's made it very difficult. I think if there was a transition into, maybe I can pull back, red meat to once a week and then include more vegetables in. Like, I know that wouldn't be a vegan diet ultimately, but I think a softer transition would yield a lot better output for these folks. Because I think what I see with the vegan diet, and I think not just me alone, but in studies that we see, is that when we do pull back from some of the protein consumption. Like one, we see our protein numbers come down because somebody who's not slowly transitioning into accommodating their protein needs with vegan options, like it's not, especially if you're going vegan and non-vegetarian, it's very difficult as a new person coming into it to hit anything above 100 grams on a vegan diet for protein, right? Like you're not, the regular average consumer coming from a meat-eating diet to a vegan diet is not familiar with cooking lentils, cooking chickpeas, right? Like you're not making these creative, nobody like tempeh, tofu, like these are things that are not regular staple items in a meat eater's diet. So when they come in to that vegan platform, it's like, what do I do? Where do I go? And that problem solving phase takes a pretty significant amount of time where we're having like 2, 3, 4 weeks of a pretty rock bottom protein number. And I think what we see out of that is like, there's just depletions too, right? We see deficits in iron, we see deficits in B12. And there's a lot of, micronutrient and macronutrient, impact that we tend to overlook when we do that switch because we want to, like, we feel all the high fives of trying all these new vegetables and grains and fruits, but we don't realize how much we're putting behind.
So they're able to have someone who's transitioning onto a vegan diet can have a ton of success right away because they're probably coming off maybe a standard American diet anyway. So they go from eating way too much and probably a lot of garbage to going to fruits, vegetables, whole grains. And so now they're feeling better probably initially. But then over the course of time, it sounds like, hey, now all of a sudden you're not getting enough protein.
Yes.
What might be a challenge of trying to get enough protein on a vegan diet, especially when, could there be gut effects with all of the beans and lentils? Like, is it even possible to get, enough protein on a vegan diet anyway?
Yeah. I think, like you said, the GI piece is a big factor, right? That's why we'll see a lot of folks, like if like veganism's not in their blood from the start, right? If they haven't been a vegan their whole life and they're just transitioning into it, what we'll see in the nutrition world is that they'll go vegan and then shift over to vegetarian so that they can include, like dairy products in to add in a little bit of protein too. And then we'll see a lot of like, I'm going vegetarian, but I want to add in eggs or egg whites. I'm going vegetarian. I want to add in, pescatarian. I want to add in fish, right? Where there's modifications being made, which is like for a dietitian, that is like the light bulb moment, right? You've realized that you were under consuming something, so you're okay bringing something else in. It's pretty awesome to see that. But then, like you said, with GI health, it's like if somebody's so committed that they're like, no, I'm going vegan and vegan only, and they're brand new to it and haven't had exposure, and like they know that one option is the only way they can get protein in with every single meal, and they're just like, it's again, it's the same concept of everything in moderation, right? Like even as a non-vegan, if I had beans with every single meal, it probably wouldn't feel so hot, right? But when you're relying specifically on those beans to be your only source of protein or your major source of protein for the day, and you tend to consume a lot bigger portion, you're probably going to have some GI funk at first. You're like, did I make the right decision or not? Because this doesn't really feel that great. I feel more bloated than before. Bowel movements all over the place.
Right.
And we see, we see a lot of change. I would say out of all the diets, it's the biggest swing coming from a non-vegan diet into a vegan diet.
And swing in terms of positive swing or swing in terms of negative? What are you saying? What are you seeing?
I would honestly say both. And positive in terms of a very, open palate in terms of trying a lot more fruit and vegetables in their diet if they weren't doing it before. So positive there. And negative in terms of, reports of GI feeling super funky. Reports of having a really, really tough time mentally and actually consuming adequate protein. Like you said before too, with protein, it's like you can have a day or two where you consume less protein than your usual, right? Or than your target, and you don't feel bad. It's like if I have 130, 140 gram protein day right now at 210 pounds, I'm like, okay, like yesterday I probably could have eaten a little bit more. That's okay. You repeat that for day 2 on a trip. You're like, okay, like this week I'm not hitting my numbers. That's okay, right? But if you're doing that over a prolonged amount of time, your body's going to get to a point where like, hey, I gave you the benefit of the doubt for 6 days it's day 7 where you're now under consuming protein. What the heck's going on? So your body goes into this like, let's pump up the inflammation. Let's put on the airbags. Let's figure out why we're in this like fight or flight mode right now, and dissolve, where the issue is. And I think a lot of people, a lot of average consumers have a difficult time, again, deconstructing why that's happening.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see people's like sort of philosophical mind games kind of come into play when all of a sudden the diet is not producing the results they expected it to. One of the things I've seen with keto diets, you see it with almost every diet, is but even the vegan diet is this like dirty vegan diet. You see it all the time. It's like there's this philosophical adherence to veganism, but then all of a sudden, okay, well, Lay's potato chips are vegan and Oreos are vegan. Do you think that like sort of this dirty vegan sort of diet is an issue? Are you seeing that? Are people trying to stick to a vegan diet while eating kind of food that's gross and maybe is metabolically affecting them in other ways?
I mean, luckily, I haven't seen too much of that.
Nice.
I totally agree with that concept, though. Like, I joke around. I actually just had this conversation last week with somebody in terms of Oreos being vegan, and that's actually the first time I heard the dirty vegan term. And being a coffee fanatic, like when I hear somebody get a dirty chai, I'm like, do you want a chai or do you want an espresso? Like, let's not combine the two, right? There's a little confusion happening there.
Right.
So I think about it in that perspective of, we know that some of these ingredients, right? When we think about Oreos, we think about, what's really in the middle. It's just, and again, this could be very wrong, but like when people look at it, they're like, oh, it's just confectionery sugar and Crisco, right? That's all the middle of an Oreo is. And I'm like, sure, it's vegan, but there's no health benefit to it. But we're just able to, I think it's more so we're just able to defend ourselves in a vegan platform of saying, yeah, but this is vegan, so I'm okay eating it, right? It's like, I think, again, it goes back to exactly where we started this conversation. Like, we need to pull people way back to 101 to say, hey, vegan, keto, regular diet, like, doesn't matter. If I was to ask you about Oreos, how would you look at it in a nutritional composition perspective, right? Like, I'm not like, I don't want you to defend something because it falls within your selected diet. I want you to know the nutritional components of what you're consuming and see how it fits, right? I think if it fits your macros was one of the trending diets that kind of created that dirty approach around it, right? Like I had somebody on just Girl Scout cookies and deli meat that they were able to hit their macros every single day, right? But what is the nutritional component of deli meat and Girl Scout cookies at the end of the day, right? There's a plethora of micronutrients we're missing. So cool that you've hit your macros, but not cool where we go to your next blood panel. Like, I don't want to be responsible for that conversation with your primary care.
Yeah, I want to get to the ultra processed stuff here in a second, but I got to ask about a couple more of these other diets because what you just said was incredibly important. So we've done keto, we've done a little bit of this vegan diet. Now the Paul Saladino craze that's going on because he's got so punchy. It's not just him. There's other people, but because there's such punchy content online, it's really, really popular right now. I've got a lot of friends, a lot of people I know doing carnivore diets. So I got to know from your perspective, as a dietitian, somebody comes in, I'm doing the carnivore diet. What are some of the pros? What are some of the cons of a diet like this?
That's an awesome one. And again, I'll kind of sprinkle in the fact that I don't get as much of the carnivore diet consumers coming in. I don't know if that's because they're stubborn and set on their ways and don't want to change it.
Probably.
Or if we're just not seeing a big enough, percentage of carnivore diet followers at the moment. And I think one of the biggest things we see with the carnivore diet, you're definitely not shy on any protein, right? If your primary consumption is meat in that sense, you're not falling short on any protein by any means. And I think one of the misconceptions are and just to defend the carnivore side, I suppose, is that, you can overconsume protein. Like, unless there is a health condition that's already there, the numbers to overconsume protein throughout the day are significantly higher than a lot of us think. So it's not really putting you in danger. You probably end up going to the bathroom more and your GI is not feeling comfortable, but you got to think about the other things, right? Like, a lot of the carnivore diet posts that I see, like, if you were on and again, this is me just like putting it on the spotlight. If you're on a carnivore diet that was like very, very beneficial, you would be spending a significant amount of money on the lean and quality cuts of meat to where that diet is no longer sustainable, right? But then if we think about some of these cuts of meat, then we think about saturated fat. Saturated fats have been linked to a lot of metabolic health risks. So if meat is a primary consumption and we're not thinking about that saturated fat piece, right, there's something that we need to start thinking about in terms of the long-term effect of what are we going to see with, you know, some of the metabolic risks that come with it.
Yeah, I think that's on both sides of it, right? We want to be fair to all these diets. Like they're all going to have positives, and a lot of them, quite honestly, are probably better than, you know, standard American diet of eating lots of processed, ultra processed foods, and et cetera. But there is drawbacks to this carnivore diet, right? They're you know, certainly getting enough protein, but then what are the other sides and other effects? And you know, you can have a, you know, let's say a dirty vegan diet. Maybe you can have a dirty keto diet. But what about a carnivore diet where, you know, you're going to Costco and just buying Costco hot dogs all day and just eating the hot dog out of the bun? I mean, what may be happening there as it relates to that, right?
Yeah, I mean, any cased meat is going to be the top contributor to saturated fats too. So, you know, that kind of holds my argument in terms of how quickly we're going to spike in saturated fats, and we're going to see some of the, you know, elevated triglycerides, and we're going to see some of these medical conditions fold a lot quicker. So I thought you were going to say more so, you know, I guess that is our dirty approach of a dirty carnivore diet, but like it's such a difficult field in terms of like, there's no, again, like I said, unless we're going for clean cuts of meat every single time, which are like wholesome quality cuts, like we're not going to be in a good place.
So let me dive deeper a little bit in this, because part of the argument for a carnivore diet or any diet is, any diet when it comes to meat, is quality cuts of meat. Let's say you're doing organic grass-fed meat, you're getting saturated fat, but higher omega-3 content. Certainly the animals aren't eating trash, and they're not maybe like hormone pumped, all these different things. Would you say there is benefit to eating higher quality cuts of meat as it relates to, like, let's say we're saying wild caught fish, wild caught salmon, grass-fed beef, as opposed to, you know, kind of your traditionally raised animal, lower quality meat? Would you say that there is a gradient there, and it's not just that meat is bad or even all saturated fat is bad, and maybe that there are variances in quality? Would that affect it?
I would say so. I would definitely see an effect. Again, I don't know if that effect is prolonging, you know, in terms of when we start seeing some of the metabolic risks unfold, if we do. But I think definitely quality is going to play a huge ingredient. And I think, again, you know, like if we go into the quality conversation of especially oils, if we're talking about saturated fats, right? Like seed oils, and a lot of the conversations we're seeing now are around the quality of where they're sourced from. So I think a quality of meat is probably going to make it a little better of an approach for sure. But then that gets me into thinking about the sustainability side of things, of like, you know, how much grass-fed cattle do we have available to us? That if 50% of the population wants to go on the carnivore diet, what do we do, right?
Yeah.
Cows don't grow fast enough. That's
well, they do if you pump them full of hormones and make them 100%. 5 times the size, and they lock their heads in vice grips and make them eat city garbage and corn and grain. Gee, that, you know, maybe it is possible. We're already doing it, but it's not sustainable to do it well. It sounds like. Potentially.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, you know, on the non-meat side, on the fish side too, like one of the biggest researches I did coming out of undergrad was, you know, comparing grass-fed bacon to farmed tilapia. And not grass-fed bacon, but more so just, you know, a clean source bacon. Right. Yeah, exactly. That we're seeing a lot more nutrition value in that bacon than in the tilapia, just because of how mass-produced that tilapia is, right? It's just like, if you think about, you know, one fish has to have numerous or possibly even several hundred babies in order to produce that kind of a tilapia cut. Like you can't go from taking a nutrient profile, separating into 2 or 3 tilapia, into separating into 100 tilapia, and then you, like, it's essentially, you know, I'm not a big tilapia fan at all, and I'm not going to be biased on how I explain it, but it's more so just like we're not seeing a lot of nutritional value that we used to, just because of mass production in that sense.
I'll be biased too. Tilapia is disgusting. It's gross, flavorless fish, and it's really cheap. But it's cheap for a reason. So you're talking 100%. About like you talk about farm fish versus, let's say, wild caught. It's easy, wild caught Alaskan salmon. I'm out here in the Seattle area. This stuff's everywhere, especially out in Alaska. They're doing a lot of this fishing. You're catching this fish. You're getting a higher quality fish, right? And so, I mean, you even see some of the stuff that some of this farm fish eats is not in its natural form. So going back to the conversation around, all right, well, human beings pulling carbohydrates out of a diet that humanity's been eating for thousands of years seems kind of foolish. Well, all of a sudden giving fish high amounts of like soybean oil and grain and corn to make them bigger and to produce faster doesn't seem smart either. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would say so. I would. You're definitely changing the evolution of an animal, and I think you said it right too. Like we're ultimately becoming, farmed humans when we start pulling those things out. So yeah, for sure.
What about as it relates to carnivore and even just any diet? What about like organ meats, especially from higher quality animals? It's such a big craze right now.
Yeah.
Getting some of those micronutrients in some of these organs. What would you say about that? Someone is like, yeah, I want to start eating more liver and kidney.
Yeah. And I growing up in Turkey, there's a lot of organ meat consumption in Turkey, but that's why I love holding this kind of conversation in a sense of like, I would defend organ meat consumption in moderation, right? But like when someone's like, all I eat is liver, then you're probably possibly overdoing. Like it's a lot fattier. There's a lot more contamination in some of these meats. Like in Turkey, you'll see a lot of like intestines, organ, brain, like a lot of these things they get consumed to where there's some research definitely for sure out there that say that, eating heart helps your heart, right? There's a lot of correlation in between the two, but I think it's a very moderation driven approach that I think that I think we as humans are set on, again, instant gratification as like the main thing, or like do more because I'll get more out of it kind of an approach. So if I'm like, my liver health is not that great, so if I eat liver, it'll help me. If I eat 10 times the liver, it'll help me 10 times as fast. That's not how it works in a lot of these organ meats. And I think that's where we tend to get lost, right? When someone's like, chomping away at a raw piece of liver, then I'm like, yeah, it looks wild. That makes me click on it on social media.
Yeah, that's right.
But if I was to season it and air fry it and have some enjoyable, delicious liver once a month or once every 2 weeks or whatever, like in a moderation or a portion that's actually normal, then it's just a much easier debate to hold.
Well, the same is kind of true. I mean, I'm curious to know what you think about nuts. I mean, when you think about, back in the day, you used to have to harvest nuts, you'd have to crack them open and consume them, but now you can just buy like a bag of like, even though most nuts, like let's say almonds or something that macadamia nuts, maybe something that you would perceive as healthy, just to be able to have like an unedited, unfiltered bag of nuts with tons of salt and seed oils over them. It feels like we're overdoing something that could be potentially good for us.
For sure. And I think portion wise, you said we had to crack open the walnut, right? I think about as a kid in Turkey, like I've never had walnuts already ready to eat. Like it was always like get the nutcracker, crack the walnut, pull the pieces out, eat it. You eat 10 walnuts at that point, you're like, okay, it's been a half hour. I'm exhausted. I want no more.
I'm done. I'm not even hungry anymore, right?
Exactly. There's a huge difference between that and dipping your hand right now into a Costco bag of walnuts and eating that's the same amount, if not 3 times the portion. I think that's where we've kind of won, but without all the seed oils and salt too, we've gotten to a place where portion control with nuts has really gone down a rabbit hole where, like, I think about shelled pistachios, right? Like I love pistachios and like they're amazing. They're delicious. And if we get into a pattern where we buy them without the shells, right? It's such an easy bag to just go in on. But they're so like nutrient dense. They're so fat dense that like you can overdo it so easily. So I think that the overconsumption is really one of the big things. Like if I'm ever trying to pull calories out of somebody's consumption, the first thing I'll ask is like, how frequently are you eating trail mix at your desk? Or when you're on the road, what's your go-to snack? And I'll always hear like, trail mix. And it's like, it's not the couple Oreos that are mixed into their store-bought trail mix. It's the several handfuls of peanuts that they'll have over the course of a half-hour window, right? It's like, it's it's those things that really first set the baseline of like why nuts have become an issue. And again, nuts have really, really good properties too. So if we can moderate them, they're great. But to your point of, we tend to go for some of the salted, roasted nuts because they're much more pleasing to when we have guests over and we put them out on a charcuterie board, or we just want to snack on them throughout the day because we have a little bit of a salt craving, and a regular, almond doesn't really do justice. What we tend to overlook is that we look at the label of something and we say, okay, this has 8 grams of fat. No crap, it has 8 grams of fat because it's almonds. But maybe in our head, what we don't realize is that 6 grams of that fat is from almonds, 2 grams is from the sunflower oil that they've roasted it in. And that's really where a lot of the overconsumption, combined with some of these additives of, a significant amount of sodium to make them salty, or a significant amount of sunflower oil to roast them to a level where they're super enjoyable to us, make them dangerous.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you brought up sunflower oil, so I got to get into the ultra processed food conversation, and seed oils. The conversation on seed oils is big right now as well. I mean, you've got things like canola oil, you've got the sunflower oil, you've got some of these more hot button oils. You certainly got the Crisco, you've got the hydrogenated oil stuff, like you mentioned, all of these things, right? But all of this plays into this conversation around ultra processed food. So if we're talking about calories in, calories out, you give me if I come in, I'm a client, you give me, let's say 2,200, 2,500, 3,000 calories, whatever it is, to eat this. Are there issues that come up eating, just hitting my calorie number, hitting my macro number, hitting my carbohydrate number, hitting my protein number, my fat number, but it's being done with things like McDonald's and pizza and lots of oils? Are you seeing that? Do you see that as an issue for people? Are there other things at play? Or is that fine?
Yeah. You would be a magician if you were to hit your numbers without.
Let's say I am. Right.
Yeah, I was going to say without going over on carbs and fats. But I think one of the big things that we do see is like it's our bodies are so good, and I love this that they do this, because this is like your body doing our work as well, of just the dietitian side reminding you that like if you hit those numbers on fast food and if you hit those numbers on ultra processed food, you're probably not going to be as satisfied or satiated throughout the day anyway. Right? It's much easier. If I made a giant bowl of salad with like all of these toppings and I just put olive oil on it and have it at home, that salad is significantly more filling and probably less calories than a sausage egg McMuffin, right? Like it's just, and if you think about it in terms of like what keeps you fuller longer, like I think one of the biggest things that we'll see with super processed foods is that the instant satisfaction is cool. Right, we have this I think about like In-N-Out Burger, one of my favorite spots, right? Like I have an In-N-Out Burger, I'm like, that was actually really satisfying, that was delicious. But then you feel a little greasy for the next hour or two. But then when the window of snacking comes afterwards, you're like, well, I'm actually really hungry again, and now I want something naughtier or dirtier because I had In-N-Out already, right? So I think that's really where we see some of the problem with ultra processed foods. Like it gets people to their numbers, their target numbers, so much quicker that you start developing a negative relationship with like, well, I have so much time in the day. What do I do now since I've already hit all of my numbers? Right? So do I just build in intermittent fasting since I have a massive window that I don't need to eat in? Right? Yeah. Or do I figure out how I can pull back some of the processed food, bring in some whole food that I make at home or meal prep or even like cater to where I actually feel satiated? Like to umbrella that entire conversation, it's like, it speaks volume. And would you rather go into the gym and hit a workout, whether it's a high intensity interval training workout, on a McDonald's meal or something you've cooked at home with some fresh fruit, fresh veggies, and a lean protein source, right? Like your body's going to speak in volume in that sense, that it kind of tells you like, probably okay here and there, but probably not okay to be a regular pattern. Yeah.
So it sounds like satiety is a big issue, right? So if you've got this hunger hormone that gets triggered by all of these processed foods, and some of that's by design. I mean, some of this is, especially, Nabisco or whatever these big companies are, General Mills, their desire is to get you not healthy, but to buy more food. Like there's an economic reason involved. And so if they can engineer this food that it triggers those cravings, then maybe mission accomplished for them.
Yeah.
I mean, let's not. I would love to just play the game that all these food companies are benevolent and kind, and they just want your best. But maybe I'm a skeptic. You're the I don't see that to be true, and it sounds like you might sort of agree at least a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, they want you to buy more, right? That's always the case. Consume more, buy more, and kind of inflate their revenue for the year. It's really ultimately where it goes. Like if you think about Pringles, right? Like I've never had one Pringle in my life. Like it would be kind of crazy to have like one chip and you're done, right? That's you kind of get into a pattern of like, okay, I can maybe have 5, and then you get into a pattern of like, well, 5 stacked is such a better mouthfeel than 5 by themselves, and then you start stacking. And it's one of those things when you buy like Girl Scout cookies or Chips Ahoy cookies or Oreos, it's like we've gotten to a place where society or even friends look at you and they're like, dude, how do you just eat one Girl Scout cookie? It doesn't happen, right? So the consumption and volume, like it's become such a norm because like you said, a lot of these companies have an amazing handle on how to make you want more, right?
Wow.
It's like they're just they've engineered it perfectly where you're like, hey, 1 was good, but 100 could be better, and then you just go down, and the thing is, again, goes back to the whole headspace mindset around it, that if oftentimes you have 3 cookies, you're like, well, I kind of threw it out the window today anyway, so maybe I shouldn't track what I'm eating. Then 3 cookies turns into 9 cookies, and you're like, well, I'm not tracking anyway at this point, so who cares, right? And then we have this like dig a hole and then correct yourself. Dig a hole and correct yourself. Like it's just this very unhealthy pattern of back and forth that a lot of these very I don't want to say the word addictive, but like very enticing to eat more ingredients tend to do to us.
Yeah. So it goes back to the whole conversation around, our fears, our frustrations, our angers, but our desires for what we want for ourselves. And if you're living this life on this, I'm all in, I'm going hard, and then I fall off the wagon. And then I've got to, maybe I take a day or 2 to just eat whatever, and then I have to go back up. And now all of a sudden I'm living this life where I'm up and down, but I'm progressively I'm progressively feeling worse. Yeah. I'm progressively performing worse. I'm progressively looking not the way I want to look. Now all of a sudden I'm living a life that I don't want to live, even though I'm giving a lot of effort to try to live otherwise. Yeah. And that's just not what we want. And also I don't know, I've seen these studies, maybe you've seen them too, around willpower and around self-control. And it feels like if you're going to try to hit your goals, whether it's your calorie goals or your macronutrient goals with a lot of these processed food, it's going to take like you mentioned, you're going to hit your number faster. And then it's going to take a lot of willpower in between meals to not try to snack. And seeing that willpower and self-control being the finite resources they are, in the sense of I've also got to exercise willpower and self-control in other areas of my life, not just eating. I've got a job, I've got to exercise, I've got kids, or I've got family or friends. There's a lot of areas. And so you're going to run out of that pretty quick, and the stresses of life get to you. And all of a sudden the thing that gets where the dam breaks is the diet.
Yes, now 100%. And one of the reasons it breaks so easily is that magically those things aren't seeing as much of an increase in price in food, right? It's like some of the unhealthier things, some of the more processed things just magically tend to stay right around the same price. Or you're like, well, it's cheap, it's easy, it's efficient, let me just go for it. Which makes it even harder for us to be like, no, thank you, I'll go for this option instead. When you're in a state of financial decision making, you're like, well, this hot dog or this slushie is like, it's only $1. Like, how bad could it be? Right? Yeah.
Right. Well, on that, just on the sidebar on that, have you seen the whole $18 Big Mac meal thing come up?
I have not.
There's a few parts of the country where there's something went viral where a lady posted, she ordered a Big Mac meal and got something on the side and ended up triggering $18 for it. And so McDonald's is catching a lot of flack right now because they're saying, well, I thought the reason why it's not like we go to McDonald's because it's the best food we can find. It's because it's cheap. You know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? So now all of a sudden, if it's not cheap and it's terrible for me, what am I doing here, right? So anyway, I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah.
But.
No, I did. And that's so funny because I just had a conversation about the hot dog from Costco, right? That's one of the conversations I have too. There's so many memes going around that say $1.50. Yeah, everything has seen inflation except for the Costco hot dog. right?
Yeah.
And the conversations that I have, everyone's like, "Oh, dude, I love the way that hot dog tastes." I'm like, "Do you love the way it tastes, or do you love the way it tastes for $1.50 hot dog?" Right? It's just
Yeah.
we have to have these conversations in our head, and I think we tend to overlook those when the monetary value is so chewable, and we're just like, "Meh, it's easy, let's do it," and then you tend to forget about every single thing we learned in Nutrition 101 coming into it.
Yeah, no kidding, right? Yeah, do you love it, or do you love it because it's $1.50? I think that's a great way to put it. Well, hey, we've been talking a long time. We're over an hour now. I have a question I would like to ask you that I typically ask most people that jump on with me or have historically, and it's, being a registered dietitian, there's going to be some people listening to this that are like, man, I'm hearing all this. There's a lot of great stuff here. There's a lot of pitfalls, but what are like 1, 2, 3 things that I could do today, this week, that could get me pointed in the right direction? Sinan, if you were going to tell somebody, like, if there was a couple pieces of practical advice for getting started on the right way towards a great diet, like, what would you say to them? Would it be like, some people have said on the podcast, get rid of gluten forever, or never drink your calories, or, whatever it is? What would be your 2 or 3 of those things?
That's a good one. I definitely wouldn't get rid of anything forever. I love moderation across everything. I would say one of the big things is, I would honestly, like, going back to the 101 approach, start by taking a look at what you're already doing, right? Whether that means you go into a free nutrition tracking app, or you just take pictures of the meals that you eat and you just compare a weekday and a weekend. Get a better understanding of where you currently stand before you commit to anything diet-wise. And just see what that gives you ideas around, right? If you have a side-by-side picture of what you've eaten for the day between breakfast, lunch, and dinner, when you see them all next to each other, you tend to, no matter what kind of a nutrition background you have, you tend to get a much better understanding of oh boy, I'm probably not eating enough vegetables looking at these pictures, right? Or I need to eat more fruit in between my meals, or I'm not getting enough protein. You don't need to be a nutrition expert to start seeing those patterns. So I would say start by just getting a better grasp on what you're consuming before making any change. Diagnose the problem first internally before you externally swing into any of these extreme diets. So I would say that's one. I would say get a water bottle that you don't mind carrying around, right? I know that's such a basic perspective, but underconsumption of water tends to be the biggest issue around why we don't feel satisfied or full, because we're not drinking enough water, and we constantly go for something that's going to fill our hands or fill our stomach instead. So go for a water bottle that you would carry around, refill, and keep drinking from. I know we're on this Stanley Cup trend right now.
Yeah, we are.
If you want a Stanley Cup, go ahead and get one. If you want just a regular water bottle, go ahead and grab one too. But if you can keep yourself more consistent with hydration, you'll just see, just better, mental state overall, energy across the day overall, and it'll just level out how satisfied you feel post-meal and pre-meal. And then last but not least, I would say, these are good questions, man. I would say before you dive into any of, and this is probably the hardest one for people to listen to and apply, but before you dive into any of the diets or fads or extremes that you see, especially on social media, I would say block out 20 or 30 minutes out of a day that you have time to just see some research behind it, right? And this is, again, me just going down the nerdy rabbit hole, but it doesn't take much time for you to hop on Google, type in, if it's a keto diet, right? Again, I'm not ripping on the diet, but if you go keto diet scholar and then search it on Google, it'll give you all the scholar articles or studies that have been done on it and just the benefits and how they've applied. Do a little bit of research, right? You would, if you were buying a brand new car, you wouldn't just be like, oh, I saw this car on Instagram, it's cool, so I went and bought a Range Rover, right? It's there's a lot of research that goes into it. There's a lot of thinking that we do behind it. So do the same for some of these workouts that you're going to apply, or some of these, different diets that you want to dabble with. Do a little bit of research and see if it's right for you, so that it doesn't turn into this 0 to 100 back to a 0 real quick.
Dude, that's great advice. Obviously, someone who's been working as long as you have in the field, man, you get to meet with lots of different people, all shapes and forms, every walk of life. And so, the practical advice, it's the little things that really get us that next level. And sometimes these punchy clips online are these really nuanced things that are stated in this matter-of-fact way that just leads people astray. And it's so much easier to go, hey man, drink enough water, do some research on the diets you see, go figure, let's see what can happen from you, and actually pay attention to how much you eat and when. Man, those little things right there can go a long way, man. If people want to find you that are listening, man, where can they find you? Social media stuff, all that.
Yeah, absolutely. So if they want to find me on social media, I'm on Instagram as dr_synonymous. So Dr. Synonymous on Instagram. Again, if they go through the StrongerU platform as well, Stronger and the letter U is the nutrition coaching company that I am with. Again, just an amazing, amazing team of about 50 coaches on our team too. So any of us are going to offer, some wonderful feedback. So you guys can find us right through the StrongerU platform as well. And yeah, any questions you have, I'm always open to answering nutrition questions. So.
That's awesome, man. Well, I appreciate you being on, dude. I'll put all the links on in the show notes. So YouTube, IG, anything, people can find those there as well. Man, hey, Sinan, thanks so much for being on with us, dude. Absolutely. It was awesome to see you again.
Yeah, you too, man. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
One more thing. The statements in this video or audio have not been evaluated by the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Information provided here is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. The information provided by this website and/or by this podcast is not a substitute for a physician visit and should not be taken as medical advice of any sort or kind. This is a list of resources for further self-research and work with your personal physician if needed. By using any of this information, by watching, listening, or reading it, you are accepting responsibility for your own health and health decisions and expressly release this podcast, its participants, and its websites from any and all liability whatsoever, including that which might come from negligence. Also, don't smoke cigarettes, don't do drugs, stay in school, don't touch hot surfaces, and please wear your safety glasses when cutting wood.